Master King's Fall just came out, and I did it, as I'm sure some of you did too. There were some things I liked, a lot of things I didn't like, and a lot of ideas that I had to improve this endgame tier of raiding. And at the end, I'll give you some loadout recommendations too, in case you are considering trying it out yourself. But even if you aren't, I'd still recommend watching this, or listening to it rather, because I think it's really important to get feedback on these types of activities from players that immediately write them off, because those groups often have some ideas that can make these aspirational difficulties look really enticing to play. So starting with the good, this might come as a shock, and I genuinely can't believe that I am saying this, but the combat difficulty felt fantastic. Enemies felt genuinely threatening, and I had to actually pay attention to what I was doing. Ammo management was important, playing cover was important, ability cooldowns were important, and teamwork was important. I understand that player skill level is a large spectrum completely, and you watching this might have already felt these challenges presented in the normal mode of the raid, which I completely respect. But as someone who loves Grandmaster Nightfalls and Day 1 raids, I love that combat difficulty that challenges me. Squishy enemies that can't kill me no matter how hard they try just isn't an enjoyable experience for me. It feels like I can't lose, but the Master difficulty brought back some of that combat risk for me. For the totems encounter, at least. My team spent about an hour on totems, learning the spawn patterns, finding that coordination for the unstoppable ogres, getting our kill rotations on the taken knights down pat, and barely squeezing out a victory while scrambling back and forth. Then we moved on to War Priest and proceeded to open a can of whoop-ass on the rest of the raid, albeit War Priest was certainly closer in combat difficulty to totems than the rest of the raid was, but it wasn't anywhere near as engaging as totems. After War Priest is where it especially got a bit laughable, with the enemies on Golgoroth, Sisters, and Oryx being a non-threat as they usually are, with the exception of the Arc Centurions on Sisters. The champions in these encounters didn't make for a noticeable difficulty increase either, considering that any encounter with overloads, such as War Priest and Oryx, you probably have someone on Divinity already for easy stuns anyway. The barrier champions were a non-factor as well, with how much of a stable Arbalest is. The unstoppable ogres and the totems encounter were the only champions that really threw a wrench into the machine in my opinion. They spawned in an awkward location where you are already fighting hordes of enemies, requiring you to press pause in your routes to take them down together in an encounter that's incredibly time sensitive. Compare that to the overload hobgoblins that spawn at the beginning of each Oryx phase that can all be easily killed before a single mechanic even begins. But that's not even my biggest gripe with the champions. Originally, champions were introduced as a lock and key method to forcibly shake up the meta from season to season by requiring us to use specific weapon archetypes depending on what the seasonal mod offerings were that time around. My buddy Mylan talked about this specific concept on Twitter a few months ago, talking about how all endgame content defaults to the lock and key principle to make it difficult, the champions being the lock that prevents you from winning, and the seasonal or intrinsic exotic champion mods being the key required to open that lock. That's not to say that this is inherently unfun, but when the entirety of the content difficulty philosophy is centered around this idea rather than things that can be increasingly unique like mechanics, it makes for encounters that are only different in their environments while they all feel identical to actually play from a combat perspective. If you really think about it, does it really feel that much different to do Master Vaults of Glass where you have to kill a bunch of champions compared to Master King's Fall where you have to kill a bunch of champions compared to Grandmaster Nightfalls where you have to kill a bunch of I think you get the point. Obviously there are some differences in the mechanics and overall goals of these activities, but that lock is the same in all three, and it can make endgame content feel like it's sorely missing variety. You also run into the problem of overly relying on this lock and key method when you have players starting to feel like they are forced to run specific loadouts, because, quite frankly, they are. If you don't have an overload weapon, there is no possible way you are killing Master Raid overload champions, which means you are forced into using a machine gun or a bow in this season specifically. Thankfully, Divinity, which intrinsically has overload, is already going to be used regardless of whether or not there is champions, which is why this problem perhaps doesn't feel as bad as it could in theory, but the problem still remains that lock and key methods like champions feel incredibly stale at this point in time. I'm not not saying we need to get rid of the lock and key philosophy entirely, I'm just saying that I think the game would feel a lot fresher if we found a new type of lock. I think something like mechanics-based champions, like the Berserkers that we fought in Scourge of the Past, would feel a lot better to fight in these master raids. A lock and key system with the key being team coordination and enemy-specific mechanical execution, rather than a specific weapon archetype and pairing mod. Speaking of which, I have a video planned talking about some fresh new ideas for some mechanics-based champions in Destiny 2, so hit subscribe if you want to see that in the future. I think these types of mechanics-based champions could make some of the endgame activities in Destiny feel much more fresh. Another problem with the Master Mode raid is the power level scaling. I have no issues with the enemies being higher light level than us and having the combat difficulty be, well, difficult, as discussed previously. But what I do take issue with is that it can be out-leveled via bounty grinding and artifact power. It makes the difficulty spike feel significantly more cheap and artificial, knowing that if I just played the game more, then it would be a lot easier. That's not to say that more playtime leading to easier activities is bad philosophy intrinsically, because it's certainly not, but it depends entirely what specific activities are being played that matters. For example, having a lot of playtime spent acquiring and leveling up new weapons and having the game be easier as a result feels fine, because logically it just makes sense. You play the game, which allows you to get more weapons, which then allows you to use those newly acquired weapons to beat harder activities to get even stronger weapons, and the loop continues. There is a sensible relation between this advancement in power. Compare that to experience, which is primarily acquired by completing bounties, the easiest milestone in the entirety of the game, being the key to easing master raids, one of the most challenging milestones in the entirety of the game. It feels like you're skipping like 20 steps. In my opinion, in a perfect world, a much more suitable system would actually be what we had back in Destiny 1's version of the normal and hard versions of King's Fall, where the hard version was a hard-capped power level, with the only way to get high enough to go toe-to-toe with those enemies was to acquire gear from the normal version of the raid or other endgame difficulty PvE activities like weekly nightfalls. But in today's world where artifact power exists and you can achieve max power just by doing 3 playlist strikes every week, that just doesn't work anymore. Power level no longer has meaning, so centering the difficulty of activities around it simply doesn't work. The only place where it does work is in contest mode activities where it's capped, such as Day 1 raids and Grandmaster Nightfalls. These activities have one set difficulty, and for me, that is part of the reason that they are so enjoyable to play. Whether you can beat it or not, at the very least, you know that difficulty you are playing is all there is, and there's no way to make it harder or easier other than practicing that activity and getting experienced with it. When an activity is designed around the idea that you are supposed to overlevel it for it to be bearable, it feels incredibly cheap and artificial. But when an activity is designed around one set baseline difficulty, it feels like the devs are saying, hey, this is how hard this is supposed to be. Give it your best shot, and good luck. And it might take you a lot of time and practice to beat it, but you can't convince me that the feeling of achievement is miles better knowing that you overcame a great challenge rather than out-leveling it. But none of this really matters at the end of the day if there are no rewards there waiting for you at the victory lap. Why put yourself through this great of a challenge if there is nothing to show for it other than pride? Currently, your rewards for the Master Raid are harrowed weapons, a ship, and a title. Harrowed weapons are by far the main reason to do master raids, but these present a huge problem in the simple fact that they can't be crafted. So not only can you not target build your perfect role, but you also can't get enhanced perks on them like you can on the regular versions of raid weapons, which basically requires you to choose between adept mods and enhanced traits, which when you are running the highest difficulty activity in the game, your reward should be something that doesn't require you to compromise on one of two things. Additionally, only being able to get one per week, depending on whatever the weekly challenge is, feels absolutely awful. Players have no reason to complete any encounter other than whatever the weekly challenge is, meaning the best way to play a master raid is to find a checkpoint for the weekly challenge, beat that one encounter, and then leave. Bungie needs to trick players into completing this entire activity the same way they trick us into completing everything else, by playing into our selfish desires and giving us something to go after. My favorite idea that I've seen so far came from my friend Pigeon over on Twitter, talking about how cool it would be to have a Master Kingsfall memento rewarded anytime you complete a Master Kingsfall from start to finish that can go on crafted weapons that applies a taken effect shader. I imagine it could look something like the Stolen Will shotgun from Destiny 1, and personally I would run Master Kingsfall as many times as it takes just to get this effect on all of my weapons. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Master Kingsfall, and before I give you loadout recommendations in case you want to run it yourself, do me a favor, drop a comment letting me know your thoughts on Master Raids and letting me know what you thought of this video as well. Usually I stick to informational, educational guide content, but my brain likes doing the longer analytical videos here and there too, so if you like them, let me know and I'll do some more of them. Anyway, loadouts. For totems, your pain points are Unstoppable Ogres, Solar Wizards, the tanky Taken Knights, and swarms of ads at long ranges. So I recommend a Kinetic Slug shotgun like Heritage with Unstoppable Shotgun, a Solar SMG like Callus's Mini Tool, and a heavy machine gun for ad clear while you're on the plates. War Priest has Barrier Knights when the boss is above half HP, and Overload Hobgoblins when he is below half HP. So you'll want Arbalist, a Void Overload bow to also help with the Void Acolytes, and your DPS linear fusion of choice. And you can also use something like a Void SMG before the boss goes below half HP for better ad clear before you run into the overloads as well if you'd like. Golgoroth only has Barrier Knights, so simply Arbalist, your primary weapon of choice, and your DPS linear fusion of choice. Sisters has Barrier Knights on the starting plates with the same DPS methods as the normal raid, so Arbalists and Legendary Rockets across the board, with one player on Divinity and another on Galahorn. Oryx has an Overload Hobgoblin on each of the 4 plates at the beginning of each phase before any mechanics start, so you can rock Arbalist, an ad clearing weapon of your choice, and your DPS linear fusion of choice, making sure to swap to an Overload bow at the beginning of each phase to drop those 4 overloads together as a team from the middle. Having one player on Divinity at all times is nice as well. Hopefully that helps you out a bit, and again, appreciate those of you who comment below and join in on the conversation. If you're new here and want to subscribe, I appreciate it very much. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a great day.